suppose this brings us to a point where, you know, part of today is around celebrating the last 10 years of the organisation. It's around, you know, giving thanks to the founder of the organisation and also to all the other men who drove up and down this country, dark nights, rainy days, developing and helping sheds to set up right around the country. And I have personal experience of that, which I'll talk about later. But at this point, I would just like to introduce John Evoy, who everybody will know as the founding member of the organisation. And there's a cake somewhere, which, you know, I'm not sure if it was John that was up all night making it or Eamonn. Both of them are taking a bit of merit for it, but I'm sure the eating of the cake will be quite as good as it looks. So we'll hand over to John.
All right, thanks a million. Lovely to be here. Come on, Eamonn, we'll do this together. Yeah. So happy birthday, I suppose.
Happy birthday to the IMSA, Irishmen's Association.
Yeah.
Thank you, John, for coming.
Oh, thanks a million for inviting me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Better be careful with that knife.
Yeah, okay. We cut a slice.
Sure. We'll have it after, I think.
We'll have it after. Well, I'll take this away. And John, just for yourself, I just want to mention that the people in Limavady made some gifts for today. So it's a little box of goodies that were made in the shed for the people here. So it's you can see lots of little they've all been done with a laser cutter and all got different things and all in Irish, and they also made the boxes.
Yeah, they're beautiful
as well. So there's one for yourself, and
thanks a million. They're lovely.
Yeah, and there was I'll just show you the one last one, because this is a special one that was made. It's similar to John's, but it was made in particular for Micheál Martin, and it's got this one in it. And as most of you would know, Micheál Martin is from Turner's Cross, and there's a very famous church in Turner's Cross, and that's it's a very famous church. It was built in 1931, an Art Deco church. So they looked it up and then they made this for. I think they put a lot of effort into it and making something really special.
Thanks for that, Eamonn, and I'm sure we'll enjoy the cake at a later point. So look, just want to welcome John, thank him very much for making his time available to come here today, to sit down with us and to reminisce about times gone past and talk about the blood, sweat, tears that went into bringing the shed movement to where it is today, and we're very grateful to John. So I just want to hand over to John to have a few words, and then when John is finished, myself and Eamonn and John is just going to have a chat, I suppose, about where the future might lie for the shed movement in general. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, Enda. Thanks a million for the invitation. It's really brilliant to be here and have this opportunity to mark the 10 years of the Irish Men's Sheds Association, which at one point in my life just felt like a pipe dream. I was a bit nervous about going on camera. I have a sore nose. I answered the door the other day, and there was a big grasshopper, and he punched me in the nose and he called me fat, but I should have known because there's a nasty bug going around. Sorry, had to do that. Yeah, so and it's always hard, and it has been you know, pretty much the most of my career to follow Barry Golden once he speaks on camera and in person. And I know we had Endo already on earlier, but Barry Golden is actually for me a motivational speaker, an inspirational speaker, and somebody who's inspired me in my life and my work for over a decade now, which is very difficult to believe. I was asked along today to say a few words, I suppose, about the origins of the association. So I just thought I'd take a very simple, just tell the story of the things that happened in the few years that might have led up to, like, the amalgamation of the Irish Men's Sheds Association as a legal entity, which happened in January 2011. So I was lucky enough. I suppose I was working in a fairly humble community development project in Ross County, Wexford, in about 2005, and we were trying to get men involved in community development, basically because up to that time there was hardly any men involved in community development, you know, or in health promotion projects or in community education projects or similar. So a few agencies got together and they started a project, and it was one of the first things I did in my career in terms of working with people, because I'd worked in different work altogether before that. And I remember clearly one day my coordinator at the time mentioning this idea about men's sheds, and it was 2006. And because he was doing some research online about how to get more guys involved, and it stuck with me. It was no big deal at the time. I do remember it very clearly. Conor Dervin was that man's name, and we continued with our little project, and it was rather successful, and it wasn't much unlike the room we're in now. We had a pool table rather than a snooker table, and we're encouraging lads to come in and maybe have a bit of breakfast. And that went grand. And I suppose it was a very different time in Ireland as well. You know, it was during the boom. There was a bit of bits of money around for community development or community education or social innovation at the time. You know, so good ideas were getting backed. And you know, I continued that piece of work, and then about a year or two later, it came up again. We were thinking about setting up a men's shed in Euros, and Barry, who we were just speaking to, was coming to visit Ireland, and I dropped him an email, and a few of us met him in the airport in Dublin for a conversation. And yeah, it was a very important moment, I think, for the Irish Men's Sheds Association, or what would turn out to be the men's sheds movement here in Ireland. Barry was traveling around the world at the time, doing some presentations on the research he had done into men's sheds in Australia, and he was telling us all about it, and he was able to articulate it really, really clearly. And I suppose in those couple of years, from 2006, you know, into 2008, the times were changing in Ireland. It was coming to the end of the good times, and the recession was on the cards. And you know, so money for community stuff wasn't as available all of a sudden. So we had to do things with a much tighter budget. So the men's shed seemed to be a really good idea from that context. You know, so a year later, I was lucky enough, 2009, to get invited by Barry and David Helmers, who's the CEO of the Australian Men's Sheds Association, who's also been a huge support to me over the years and to the organisation and to the global movement of men's sheds. And I got to go to Australia in 2009, and I went to their national conference and in Tasmania, but also visited several men's sheds across Victoria, New South Wales, and in Tasmania. And yeah, it was just like an aha moment for me. It was like, we have to make this stuff happen in Ireland. You know, in that year, 2009, the recession had hit. There were suddenly tens of thousands of guys out of work in Ireland, you know, struggling in lots of ways. You know, maybe had mortgages that they were struggling to meet the repayments on, and the associated stress that goes along with that. So in a way, there was a perfect storm for men's sheds in Ireland. There was a huge demand for something that fellas needed support, you know, and these were your ordinary down to earth working lads, as well as every other man. Like Barry went on there a little bit about how inclusive the sheds need to be, you know, a lot better than I could. So yeah, so one of the things I picked up from that trip in Australia was a conversation with Dave about how the Australian Men's Sheds Association had set up. Barry mentioned the first shed in the world was set up in 1998 in Australia. I think it was in Lane Cove in northern Sydney. And between that 1998 and about 2007, I think there was about 70 sheds after being set up in Australia. So about 70 sheds over a decade. They set up their Australian Men's Sheds Association in 2007. And pretty much from that time, they had a peak body or an organisation that could support any community to have a shed to set one up. The numbers of sheds in Australia doubled every year for the next 5 or 6 years until they passed 1,000 sheds. And that was the one thing I kind of latched onto. I came home from that trip with a bit of determination to set up an Irish Men's Sheds Association. Because I wasn't the only one, and far from it, that were thinking about men's sheds in Ireland at the time. There were several. The first men's shed in Ireland was started in Tipperary Town in August 2009. While I was on that trip in Australia, nothing to do with me, completely their own initiative. Similarly, there was a CDP in Arklow who had an Australian coordinator. There were Mary Nally up in Meath with the third age was looking at setting up sheds. There was County Louth, there was Coming Afar in Galway. There was quite a lot of people on the same page. So we went about putting an organisation together, which we kind of launched a year later in Gorey in 2010. At the time, we called it the Men's Sheds Forum because it wasn't a legal entity. And we would have kind of considered ourselves, you know, there was a few of us there that we called ourselves the caretakers of the men's sheds kind of concept for Ireland. We didn't really have a mandate of membership to do anything, but we were doing it anyway. And I remember at that conference in Gorey, which was hosted by Wexford VEC, which turned out ETB subsequently, you know, we said who wanted to be involved in this, and nearly every hand in the room went up. And I think at that time there were 7 sheds who were the kind of the ones that were up and running in Ireland. Then, as often things do in Ireland, we tried to start get a bit of funding. We realised we had to be a legal entity. We went and put stuff in place to create an organisation, and there was a funding deadline for January 2011, and it was like in a real hurry to get that funding application in, but we had to be a company limited by guarantee. So it was like we put the first official board together, and it was like my wife Sarah, my father-in-law, and a couple of friends who had been involved, if you know, in the conversations up to that point. We were unsuccessful in that funding, of course. So it was only an idea really at the stage. But what I did do was set up a legal entity, and then we had to go ahead and start, you know, trying to follow the ethos that the sheds are all about, you know, by the men and for the men. So we fairly quickly anyway, tried to have our first AGM where pretty much all of that first founding board stepped down, and we tried to elect guys from across the country onto the board. That was in Monalty, I think, was in the fall or the autumn of that year, and I think there was about 30 sheds in Ireland at the time. So that was kind of how things grew. That was our first board. It went on with, you know, each year then kind of the AGMs were kind of milestones, and it was a way to kind of see how many new sheds had been grown. I think the year later we were in Carrigaline, there could have been 70 sheds set up. Following year we'd gone over 100. Then I think we had the last kind of big conference I was involved in was in 2014, and it was in DCU in Dublin, and I think there was over 300 sheds in Ireland at the time. And it was a roller coaster a few years, you know, like Enda said, there was a lot of traveling around, you know, going to meetings wherever. Like obviously there weren't that many meetings in sheds at the time because there weren't the sheds there, but there were fellas meeting in community centres or meeting in pubs or you know, and it was really inspirational work. You'd meet a few guys and you know, it'd be, what's all this men's shed thing about? And within a half an hour or an hour, you know, because the concept is so easy and kind of common sense when you explain it, that they get it, and you know, you're leaving people with this kind of you know, bundle of motivation to go doing something, you know, that's going to make a difference not only to them but also to their communities. You know, that very first board that we put together, I suppose the biggest kind of piece of work we did that was left with the organisation afterwards. We done a bit of a document that was kind of to be our ethos and our philosophy, and I think it stood the test of time very well. You know, it talked about how, you know, the Men's Sheds Association sees, you know, each man as both a teacher and a learner, you know, and that we all have something to learn from each other. You know, it talked about the way each men's shed should be autonomous, you know, and that the national organisation is there to support them all. And that it comes from, it's a grassroots organisation that, you know, takes its guidance from its membership, and all those things that like turned out are kind of really important when I was only learning this as I went, and I made plenty of mistakes as well, you know, and one of the mistakes I made over and over was like thinking of great ideas. You know, I said, oh, I know what we'll do with the sheds. At one stage we got a funder to fund a shedder's card, and everyone was going to get discounts off things, and we got to put in 6 months of work and pushing it, but sure, it fell. Do you know why? Because it didn't come from the men in the sheds. It was something outside that we thought we knew better, and I think I've had to learn that lesson a good few times. You know, the things that work best in the men's sheds are always been the ideas that come from the men. I had a colleague who was doing similar work in in London, and he said he used to have a mentor, and he said, and his mentor used to tell him, whenever you get a really good idea, get down on your knees and ask God to take it away. So I haven't done that as often as I could have over the years. You know, I suppose what happened, we got our first bit of funding. It was from the Arthur Guinness Fund, believe it or not. Guinness gave it. I don't know if we could take that money now these days, you know, after, you know, but that was, that meant I could go from doing this voluntarily, you know, while working a job with DTV to working for the association. That happened sometime, I think, in 2012. And, you know, another few funding successes happened then subsequently, one after another. And I suppose experienced some growing pains, like any organization out there that goes from voluntary to having a body with some staff and stuff, you know, who does what then and all that, and it's very tricky. And, you know, and I think we negotiated reasonably well, or as well as any other organization did as well. Anybody else who I've ever spoke to, gone through the same process, struggled with it too, you know. And it's just that you know, the evidence of the success is that we're here 10 years later, you know, despite however many challenges, you know, and even after my time having to deal with COVID over the last couple of years, it's like, if I had a hat now, I'd be taking it off or tipping it to people who've you know, got through that in such a supportive manner, you know. But I think, and what I could see from the little interaction I would have had would have been that you know, the men in the sheds found a way to continue to support each other, even when they couldn't meet up face to face. And that's testament, I suppose, to the spirit of the whole thing, you know. And another great initiative that I was involved in, it was like fairly early on, we realized that there was people who weren't only passionate about setting up a shed in their own community, but they wanted to help the movement in general. And we set up a group of men's sheds advocates from all across the country who did Trojan work, going out and helping other communities set them up. And, you know, if I had more time, or if I was better prepared, I'd probably have a list of names in front of me to start thanking people, because, you know, that was one thing I just found over this journey, was like the countless people who I'd never met before, who just came out of the woodwork, willing to give their time and energy and resources to make this thing a success, you know, and really grateful to all of those, you know. And I know that after my time as well, there was other groups of people, like there was groups of volunteers and others who continued that great work. The team grew, you know, and it's just been, you know, it's I'm sure it's been challenging, like any organization, and particularly any non-profit organization, because, you know, there's always a challenge when you get funding from one hand and you're saying the guys in the shed make the decisions in the other hand, but the funders mightn't be on the same page and all that. Like, no matter how grateful you are to funders, that's a difficult journey to negotiate. The chair, George, at the time, who might have been your successor, would have often said, you know, the challenge, whoever plays the fiddler calls the tune. And we used to have to challenge, you know, struggle with that a little bit, like, you know, but yeah, I'm just really grateful for everybody who has supported the journey over the years. I suppose my own story a little bit then with Men's Sheds came to kind of an end around that time. We were talking about the conference in DCU. I found myself burnt out and had my own challenges, which I suppose plenty of guys have experienced as well. But I would have got burnt out and I had to step back, and, you know, and with the support of the board and everything at the time, I stepped back for a year. That was the decision at the time. I suppose it was interesting. I'd spent the 5 years or so going around the country encouraging lads to look after their well-being, and all these you know, tips and systems and structures that were going to support people to lead better lives. And I kind of took the eye off the ball myself, you know, and I was in a proper bit of bother there for a while, you know. But I, you know, still grateful for the support at the time. And then what happened, I suppose, when that year was over, I just saw how well the association was getting on without me, and it was kind of a natural thing to not try and come back and maybe to support in a different way. I got involved with the international stuff that Barry spoke about there for a while as well, you know, and had some really cool experiences. We brought men's sheds to Kenya, for example, and, you know, things that I would have never dreamt would have been part of my life, you know, before I heard of this idea of men's sheds or whatever 10 years previously. But yeah, I just really glad to be here today and to be involved in this. You know, it's amazing to see something 10 years later and to be invited back, you know. And one thing I was thinking about when I was driving down the car, you know, one kind of story that sums it up for me, and it was one of the guys who was involved in setting up men's sheds. It was one of the advocates actually, and he was from Wicklow. And he was saying they put up a few signs in their local town about setting up a men's shed and the phone number on it and meeting on Monday night or whatever. And he got a call from a guy who was saying that, you know, what's this men's shed thing all about? And he was explaining, you know, actual fellas coming together and having a bit of a laugh and a cup of tea and not much more to it than that. You know, he could do some woodwork or whatever, but he could tell your man was low in confidence. And he said, will you come along? And he said, I would. And he said, will you bring a friend? And your man said, I don't have any. So, but he was quick enough and he said, well, you do now, you know. And I think that's what men's sheds are all about. And that story and many others have stuck with me since. So thanks, thanks, Enda. Nice to be here.